This work is a long-term process that I am engaged with since I think, it's from my academic times only that I was interested in the representation of landscape and also how Shantiniketan, artists in Shantiniketan responded to this idea, which is a Victorian idea that also evolved in Europe, this landscape representation in middle of 15th century, 16th century. And then Shantiniketan also dealt it, artists like Binod Bihari Mukherjee, Nandalal Bose, even Ramkinkar Bej, dealt with the idea of representation of landscape in a certain form and certain way, which has its own modernist and nationalistic and also individual interpretation of the language of representation of landscape. So, but I was always intrigued that whether landscape is only about representing or it is also about a relationship that builds through way of working, way of living, way of engaging. And I think that also associates it with Tagore's orientation of looking at space and landscape, also how he situates institutions inside the landscape, learn from the natural landscape. So, learning from landscape and also representation of landscape has its own conversation, and if we look at the practice around landscape, it has this very interdisciplinary way of representation that has evolved through different disciplines like geology, like geography, like botany, like anthropology, like history, like geography. So all these different disciplines have built up their own way of engaging with the landscape from a representational form. But there is also this notion of engaging with landscape as a everyday livelihood situation, work situation, expressions, relationship with material, metaphors, cultural identities, body, politics of representation, and ownership of space. So all these things together configures the notion of what we call or what we experience as landscape. So how, as a visual artist, and each of these methods incorporate certain kind of visual tools, very interestingly. And if we look at the history of landscape representation, all has become very specialized way of looking at landscape and its changing relationship. So how within the discourse of landscape representation we can bring these different tools together, because they often operate in isolation, they often operate in their own specialized way of looking into landscape. So this led to my own investigation that how landscape representation can become an interdisciplinary framework where different tools of representation and engagement can also be approached. So this is more of a bringing in some of those fragments of those, because these are all specific works that has happened in different times. So here I am trying to bring those residues into another site of trying to configure the definition of a landscape as a kind of a physical site and not a representational site. So people are encountering into the space, they are walking through it, but apparently it is not the physical landscape, but the memory of different forms of engagement with the landscape. So here you will see during those 6 interactions, we were making shamiyanas for the gatherings, and those shamiyanas are basically census reports. So apparently if you look at the shamiyana, they look like abstract designs, but they are also basically graphs of how much percentage of forest land is there, how much work people are doing, so like that. So trying to merge these different tools together into the space, and also those 6 gatherings had almost 1 day full workshop based interaction. So there was no presentation but more interactions. So those films are being shared in this project together with the shamiyana, and also the soil collection that I have done in different mojas to understand that soil is also a metaphor of the body and the material and the culture. So trying to bring these different fragments of materiality, knowledge, participation, coming together as a, so that's why I called this project as this is only one part of it. So this anatomy of a landscape, a study of a collective engagement, is one way of trying to frame it, and that is also because of the site, because it's a document. I really didn't want to put it up again back into the nature. I wanted it to be really removed from the nature and see how we can create a meaning out of it with the fragments, because what happened in that space we cannot recreate, those gatherings that we did. So how to create another gathering out of it, how to create another meeting point of these different spaces. So I needed a separate space. But so when in the Biennale, initially I was interested in the interior, but then when this space was suggested, I came and saw it's a big, it's also part of the Mitali house, which is the old house, one of the oldest house in this locality. So it has that transformation of the landscape as an observation. This house has observed it, and it also poises a certain critical position in occupying a space. So I thought that it would be interesting that how I bring in the landscape back into the private space and open it up into a public space. So this process has been a hugely collaborative process, because it started off as an individual's investigation into landscape, but then it could never be completed without participation of a lot of other disciplinary practitioners. So I first approached a theatre group called Sahityika, and Devanshu Majumdar, the director of who is an economist. So with him I started conversing about it. Then it went into different professors of different departments, Malay Mukhopadhyay and Bishwajit Das, and a lot of other geography, literature disciplines I started work. Then I started interacting with my friends living in the spaces. There are contributions of many people together in this work, because as a work, if you say, this is a project which cannot be done by one person and cannot be owned by one person. It is a shared space and contribution of many of the practitioners who are living in Birbhum. I am just trying to create a space to bring these things together, but the content is generated by the people living in Birbhum and in the University of Vishwabharati at this point. So it's more of a conversation between different practitioners.